Yes. Yeah. The gentleman you're about to hear is a guy named Dale Hill, and this is his presentation to the Charlotte City Council on October the 27th, 2008. Now, Dale is a friend of mine, and he was trying very hard to be a friend of Charlotte because he wanted to bring a manufacturing company here to build hydrogen-powered streetcars, which is what we're going to be talking about. Unfortunately, the technology that he was interested in never got any press coverage, and as a consequence, there wasn't any agitation to recruit him, and he is now happily ensconced in South Carolina, in Greenville, where he was referred to by President Obama indirectly in the State of the Union message, and the next day President Obama sent the Secretary of Transportation and the Administrator of the Federal Transit Authority down for a press conference to say this is my beloved poster corporation, in which I'm well pleased. And so we lost a very big one, including 1,300 jobs. So the point is that this is not something that I made up. This is a very real business opportunity that we're trying very hard to bring to North Carolina, even now. And with that, I'll let you listen to Dale.
Welcome to Madera and to our factory here in Golden, Colorado. I'm Dale Hill, founder and CEO of Madera. We design and manufacture advanced transportation solutions for the industry that are both friendly to the environment while being very fuel efficient, such as this bus standing behind me here, which is a composite body hydroelectric hydrogen fuel cell bus that will be delivered to Columbia, South Carolina next year. Last year at the National Hydrogen Association conference on uses of hydrogen by the military, we dialogue with HEAT, which is the Hydrogen Economy Advancement Team in Mooresville, North Carolina. Mooresville saw the coming transition of rail technology, including transit from diesel and external overhead catenary type systems. And they saw that the solution to that could be onboard hydrogen fuel cell power over 5 years ago. Passenger Transport, which is a journal for the American Transit Association, picked up this vision and published an article in 2007, I believe it was in February, dealing with streetcars using, or hydrollies using hydrogen as a fuel source. Given after the long-standing prediction that streetcars are poised for a major resurgence, I came to Mooresville, and I met with Mayor Thunberg, Stan Thompson, and Heat, and the Mooresville South Iredale Economic Development Corporation, and others. Since we've recently taken over the manufacturing of our composite bodies from the North Carolina company that had originally committed to building these bodies, and since Mooresville is the center of international hydro activity, it would make sense that North Carolina should be the place that we go if we decide to develop this business. And I would add that we can also manufacture our transit and school buses there. With that in mind, I've inquired with the North Carolina Department of Commerce, Mooresville, Iredale County, and others about location incentives. The market for hydraulics is very attractive. After some 50 locations are pursuing conventional streetcars, even though that they have to pay $2 to $4.5 million per mile extra for the overhead catenary system to support that. It stands to reason that a wireless hydraulics can provide the traffic and pollution mitigation in high-density development without these penalties. Demand should be considerably greater. Hydrogen buses have been in service around the world for the last 6 to 8 years, and adapting that technology, such as in this bus, to a trolley is no great technological hurdle to overcome. Specifically, since steel wheel vehicle has about 7 times less rolling resistance than a rubber tire vehicle. The result will be lower operating expenses, a much more attractive visual environment. Back in April, Mayor Thunberg, Stan Thompson, and I discussed the hydrail briefly with John Mayu of CATS, airport or for the Central Avenue routes, perhaps even as a rail alternative to bus rapid transit to the airport, that would obviously make locating our plant here in Mooresville very, very attractive. If you're interested, we're interested. Thank you.
So that's how close we came. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the nature of this new technology, how it applies to Charlotte, and how you can be instrumental in implementing it, or at least advocating it for the extension of building in Charlotte, because it is a green technology and therefore within your purview. Let's go ahead and, is there a clicker here? Thank you. Okay, let's click. Okay. Our learning objectives here today are to identify options for exploiting the emerging hydraulic trend, identifying the effects of proximity to the hydraulics in building from a green perspective, formulate optimal decisions for choosing site locations based on streetcar availability, and formulate green solutions that enhance Charlotte's competitive position. And the bringing of Proterra here was such a solution. Why think about alternatives to the existing traction technologies? Well, the first one to think about is emissions. The emissions from diesel, for instance, are extremely hazardous. The EPA has found, and you've probably heard, that the fine particulates actually penetrate the lung walls and get into the blood and tend to concentrate in the heart muscle. So it's a serious environmental problem. Not as serious probably as it was in 1925 when Ingersoll ran and General Electric and American Locomotive came up with what they call the oil electric locomotive, which was the hydrail of its day. It was the super clean alternative to all the smoke that steam locomotives put out. So we are in a comparable situation today in that Charlotte, of course, is faced with up to $6 billion with a B dollars in sanctions and withholding transportation funds from the Fed if we get too far away from air quality attainment as measured by the EPA. And of course, if you've been by to fill up recently, you know that the affordability of petroleum fuel is questionable. That's not just for us, and it's not just for the airplanes, which you get a lot, but it's also for the people that run railroads. And one of the first major papers that was written on hydrail was written by a person who was analyzing the risk to the American railroads of depending on foreign oil for all our internal heavy logistics. So federal non-attainment sanctions, we talked about it. And road capacity exhaust is not generally known, but it's not possible to build your way out of congestion. That has been known. It was known back long ago when I was still with the telephone company and working on this issue with DOT. What happens is that the peak load simply squashes out so that you've got the peak load at 6:30 to 9:30 instead of being at 7 to 8. So even if the economy was such that we could afford, there's just so much of any country that you can pave. And so the automobile is not a permanent solution no matter what you do. And so the question is, what are you going to do to deload some of that traffic onto public transit and light rail? And we believe hydraulics are going to be one of the alternatives. I coined the term Hydrolly so it can be found on the internet. And it's just simply a hydrogen trolley. Trolley means to drag behind, so it's really not a very accurate one, but it it's an alternative to the trolley, and so I wanted to have that application. The first time I ever saw one was at the Hydrolly conference in Herning, Denmark, in 2006, and it was designed by Alstom. They actually, I think you can see a picture of it if you go to the website. If you have something to write with, you might want to jot this down: www.hydrail.org. That is the Hydrolly website at the University of North Carolina at Boone. That is Appalachian State University, and it is now the world's central location for Hydrolly location of information. It's visited by about 800 unique visitors every month from typically 50 to 60 countries. So North Carolina is kind of ground zero for the concept of Hydrolly, although it wasn't invented here, invented in Colorado. But we are the come-to location for information about where it is and where it's going. The technology that is most likely, I think, to be early used is the configuration that Dale Hill was showing with that bus, and that is a battery dominant. It's got a great big battery and very modest sized fuel cells. Fuel cells run flat out, and the battery accumulates. It's charged off the grid overnight, and then it accumulates the stopping power as well as acting as a reservoir for the fuel cell power. So it's essentially an electric bus. The stopping and going is modulated electrically, and the wastage, if you will, is replaced by the fuel cell. So that's generally how it works. That's probably going to be the main way that this sort of thing happens. As Dale said, the hydrogen buses have been around for a long time. There's absolutely no reason why we don't already have hydrogen streetcars today. It could have been done any time in the last 6 or 7 years. It's only the thinking about it. Nobody has felt it necessary. That's about to change, and that's about what we're going to talk about today. Well, of all the ways that you can use hydrogen on rail, the easiest is on a streetcar. The reason is that the scale is about right, and that you've already got the hydrogen bus. This is just a little bit of a markup of Dale's hydrogen bus to put steel wheels on it. It's a very simple matter to modify the design to put the same traction system on a streetcar. And as Dale said, about 1/5 to 1/7 the rolling friction. In other words, a well-inflated bus tire feels to the traction system about like riding a large flat tire on a bike as compared to a fully inflated English bike tire, being the steel wheel equivalent of it. That's less important than might meet the eye, because the big cost of running a streetcar system is not the fuel. But if you can save something like 80% on your fuel cost, that's nice too. This costs $4 million per kilometer of track. That would equate to about $7 million per mile. It's probably higher by now. Here's the price of copper. I didn't have a slide that went all the way up to the present, but it would be about right here. This is the down spike when the economy tanked, but if you see, it's already up to an all-time high, and nobody thinks that we're anywhere near out of the recession yet. So even as bad as things are, the cost of copper is at an all-time high. The reason is that China and India have entered the game, and their domestic demand is enormous. And I only learned recently that there's some blends of steel. Anybody here from Nucor? Nucor, remember, that actually copper is a component in some mixes of steel, and of course the Chinese and Indian demands for that add to it. So copper is getting to be a limiting resource very rapidly. but it is the main resource that's needed for the external electrification, particularly the overhead wire. So I might take a minute there and say it's not, the overhead wire is not where the big use of copper goes. You have to have the grid extended and run along the track to the substations that boost the voltage up, and you have to have all the connections through the switching systems and connecting up to the overhead wire. So the copper that it takes is truly enormous, and that's one reason it costs as much as it does. I'm glad to see we got a lot of folks from Duke here, because I'm a member of the production of energy subcommittee at IEEE, and I'm very proud shareholder. I really like Duke. So one way this is going is that some of the off-power nuke that is now used to pump water uphill in Ocoee could be used to electrolyze hydrogen and have very low carbon footprint for the streetcars. So that's one in Charlotte at least, and so that's one thing that I hope very much will happen. And to that end, I hope Duke will carry this back, and somehow Jim Rogers needs to find out about this. Jim comes from Ohio, where they are very much keen on the whole hydrogen economy. I hope one day he's going to look down and notice what we're doing and put his blessing on it as part of the energy hub. We see the steel wheel is spinning very nicely on the energy hub, so hopefully the Duke guys can help us with that. This is just a little sketch, and this is me and not Katz, but here's the blue line, the North Corridor. If these things, if Hydrolly existed, what they would be little feeder routes that would run around through neighborhoods and would carry commuters to the long haul and the fast haul blue line light rail. Light rail is by definition overhead wire. That's part of the actual definition of it. I don't think that's going to be so forever for the reasons that I just mentioned. The cost of the electrification is too high, and at some point it's going to become prohibitive. The sooner we understand that it will eventually become prohibitive, then the sooner our planning can begin to reflect what follows it. And what follows it is either going to be some version of an intermittently charged battery, or most likely, I believe, the hydrogen fuel cell powering the batteries. So it's a battery-dominant hydrogen fuel cell supported system. One of the most interesting applications, I think, would be to run a Hydrolly or a commuter rail using fuel cells out to the airport. One of the best impressions you could possibly make would be to have a technology that green and that avant-garde for people who come into Charlotte by air. So right now they're planning bus rapid transit, which has got a lot of merit to it, but steel wheel has got a certain panache that buses don't have, and I would covet that for Charlotte. There's a catenary rebellion going on in Europe. The first place where it happened was Bordeaux, France, and it's a beautiful cathedral town, so they said we can't have, we've buried all our other utility plant, and so we've got these wires. This is not really Bordeaux here. These wires going through, and why not have all the plant buried and make our city look beautiful? And so they got Austin to come up with an alternative. The alternative they came up with was not hydrogen. The reason is that they have a very large embedded fleet of streetcars, and they could much more economically modify them to add batteries than start all over with new rolling stock. And also they had the power distribution plant already out there, and they could much more easily take down most of the catenary and have a little catenary at the stop that they zap the car with, and with just enough juice to get to the next stop. So that has been the European model, and it's what I would do if I were there, because you've got a huge embedded base, and you might as well use it. But where you don't have an embedded base, it would be a ridiculous thing to even consider, and we don't have much embedded base here in the states, and that's what we're here to talk about. Those of you who are with Duke, as I said, I was with Bell South, and so even back when there was a Southern Bell, we know how much it cost back then to bury those utility wires, and it doesn't come cheap. And the idea of still having some up, or even worse, putting some back up after they've all been buried, is a really repellent idea to me as an old utility guy. And I imagine a lot of the Duke folks would tend to agree with that. If you could have electric power running the streetcar without having the overhead wire, for goodness sakes, we ought to do it. This is the takeaway statement. If you only remember one thing from this, please let this be it. If overhead power for streetcars did not already exist, and it's 120 years old, so it's tested pretty well, it would never be suggested as an alternative. If there were not streetcars, never had been streetcars, but suddenly people said, well, we got to have relief to the automotive load, what are we going to do? And somebody says, I know, we'll spend $10 million a mile and put telephone poles up and hang clotheslines across from them and put a stick on top of the streetcar and drag it along, and we'll use power during the peak, most expensive on-peak commuter times. And you'd get some really weird looks, and that wouldn't happen. And yet, because it exists, and only because it exists, it's our first consideration. As a planner, this is, please, let's don't do that. Let's learn. Let's not ride the thing all the way down. So. The reason that we're looking at streetcars with overhead wires is only because they exist. They are proven. You can get them. And if that's all the consideration you have in your planning, then, I abandon my case. But if you look and see what's coming, it's absolutely clear that hydrogen-powered trains are what's on the track coming down. How many of you know that Burlington Northern Santa Fe has had a hydrogen switch engine switching freight traffic in Los Angeles for over a year and a half? Did anybody know that? I mean, Hydrail is here. The thing was invented using money supplied by the U.S. Department of Defense, as well as the Department of Transportation, as well as the Department of Energy. And the reason is that locomotive has the ability also of serving in case of an emergency, such as a hurricane, as a self-powered power plant that could run in and restore power temporarily and then go back to its normal use. So that's why the military thought it was a neat thing to have in their portfolio. I would like very much to see a version of that be used out at the Charlotte Airport for the intermodal system, air to rail, because the airport has very serious pollution problems and carbon dioxide problems and all the problems that a hydrogen-powered switcher or switchers could take care of if it existed. So. And we said why the first streetcars overseas were not hydrogens, because they had the embedded cars and distribution plants, so it made sense to do a minor modification of it rather than starting over. And again, as a stockholder in anything, you know that your obligation to your fiduciary clients is to make the embedded capital last as long as it can. And so utilities have very little incentive from their shareholders to scrap everything and start over. That's not something that when I wear my shareholder hat that I like to encourage my companies to do. But when I wear my green hat, I have a different attitude toward that. This is in my strategic planner hat. No technology lasts forever. They tend to go away. They have a period of innovation when it was just invented, then they have a period of integration when the state of the art constantly gets refined, as coal plants have been, for instance. And then all of a sudden you reach the point to where there's another innovation and you begin a second transition. But this is the nasty time to be, and this is exactly where we are right now. And what happened, the kind of things that happens now is that administrative law and regulation and stuff that doesn't have anything to do with good engineering technology or even good environmental planning controls, because it's in the nature of regulation that it is looking back. It adjusts things that are and have been, and it doesn't regulate. You don't regulate new things into existence. So the very body of regulation tends to be a force for against change. And of course, there's a natural human comfort with what exists. And so we tend to say, well, we know what a streetcar looks like, a trolley car looks like, and how it works. So we actually are willing to accept a greater risk than innovating would be, even though it might seem less scary simply because it's familiar. So what's driving the streetcar renaissance? Well, our cars now own us. I lived for a short time in Manhattan and didn't take a car up there. Would not have wanted to have a car up there. When I went out to see the leaves in Vermont, I rented one. But it gave me a paradigm to think about, that our cars own us to a large degree. We have to pay to buy them. We have to pay to finance them. We have to pay to store them if we drive downtown. We have to, and we probably would if we lived downtown. We have to pay to insure them. We have to pay to fuel them to make them go. They're not cheap things. And if you could have a lifestyle, if you lived in a high-density place served by streetcars, then a large fraction of the new people, the green people, the young people, would say, enough of that. Who needs it? I'll do without, and I can go every place I need to go and do everything I need to do with the streetcar. So that's what is drawing streetcars back. The air quality is more than back. Even when I was still with the telephone company, we did a study and found that more than half of the people felt that they were environmentalists, and more than and of all the issues that they felt was important to air quality was the most. Urban sprawl, cost for road and utility infrastructure deployment, and so condensed high-density urban cuts the cost of everything that it eventually flows through to the individual citizen's cost of living. And as I said, a young, growing urban preferring demographic is going to see a different paradigm. When I grew up, the car was the very emblem of liberty. It was the very freedom. It's what allowed us to move around, allowed us to live where we wanted to live. But that isn't the only paradigm that's around now. The other paradigm is that it's kind of a ball and chain, and that is that if you would like to live without one, as I did for a while in New York, you do okay. So that doesn't mean I'd rather live in New York than on Lake Norman, but it means that's a point of view, and it's a growing one. And we are raising our kids rightly to be more environmentally sensitive than we were. And as they do, this is part of that raising, is to understand that the car is not necessarily an unmixed blessing. I would like to say parenthetically that it has been an unmixed unblessing to those of us who are interested in the hydrogen economy, because it is kind of like a bugbear that the media hold up. They say that hydrogen is a car technology, and it's not going to be available for another decade. Well, it is a car technology, and it's not going to be ubiquitous for a couple of decades, but that is not what it's all about. It's immediately available for streetcars and buses and standby generators and cell tower backup systems and telephone central offices, and a lot of Coca-Cola's forklifts and somebody else's pallet movers and a lot of things that are uninteresting and not like the Tesla or the Leaf car, but still, that is what the hydrogen economy is really about. It's about taking the electric grid and making it available to things that move. And it's also about taking things that are intermittent and may not be available at the time when power demand is the greatest, and allowing them to store the energy and make it available for when it is. So it's a magic extension cord, and it gives, essentially, hydrogen is, I think of it as part of the power grid. It gives the utility of time and the utility of place to the power grid. And looking way forward, the recent past president of the Electric Power Research Institute painted I thought, a very persuasive picture that it will eventually be a way that some power is actually transmitted. The overhead power is not necessarily to be with us forever. There is a new generation of nuclear power on the drawing boards that uses what's called pebble bed reactors, and they're helium cooled. The bottom line is they make very high temperatures available, much higher than water cooled reactors, and that can be used by a process called thermochemical water splitting, and that essentially means you take the heat, you got a black box, you put heat in one end and water in one end, and hydrogen and oxygen come out the other. And it is very cheap hydrogen. And the University of Ontario Institute of Technology is working on a version of this using copper and chlorine technology, and the Savannah River National Hydrogen Laboratory in South Carolina is working on a version that uses iodine and sulfur technology. So the bottom line is, and that's just two of them. So the bottom line is, hydrogen is cheap compared with fuel if you do a totally allocated cost study. You don't have to dig it out of the ground in halfway around the world and defend it with an army and haul it across the ocean. In fact, they did, Dale Hill, who opened the show here, took his bus to the testing place and found that it's actually already cheaper than diesel with existing prices. Now, petroleum is as cheap as it's ever going to be. It might have a few down spikes, but it was 38 cents per super premium when I was a kid. So I have no reason to think that is not going to be a zigzag continuing growth. And even if it were not, the environmental and climate problems, we're going to run out of it eventually. So it's not good economics to wait till you run out before you start developing the alternative. If you think of the petroleum industry as being like a big oak tree, and you've got a big root that goes to the Saudi, and a big root that goes to the Gulf of Mexico, and a big root to the North Sea, and one to Alaska, and one down to Brazil. And you think about all the oil companies as the trunk, big oil, where it all comes together. And you think of the biggest branches as being like Shell and Chevron and all the big companies, and then Mr. Patel's convenience store is the Leaf. Then that's a way to look at petroleum. But there will never be a hydrogen tree. Hydrogen is too ubiquitous to bother to ship. The metaphor for hydrogen will be a yard full of azalea bushes, and you plant your azalea bush where it'll look good. if you happen to have wind energy, then you make your hydrogen out of wind. If you happen to have natural gas, for the time being, you may make it out of natural gas. If you have wave energy, you make it out of waves. You make it out. If you have a lot of solar thermal or solar geothermal, whatever you got, you can make it out of that. And so everybody will make their own hydrogen out of whatever's close. And they're making new and better ways to make hydrogen all the time. So hydrogen is kind of like a manifold. A lot of different ways. It's all alike, however you make it. And you put it in the manifold, and whoever needs it takes some out. It's net metering from people in the power industry will recognize it. So that's where hydrogen is going. It's going to be interchangeable with copper in a lot of ways. It's going to be an alternative and a reinforcing way of delivering electricity. And as I said, it can deliver it to things that move. This is a late 2006 or early 2007 forecast of streetcars. And this was prepared by the American Streetcar Committee of the American Public Transportation Association. Back in 1980, there were only 7 streetcar systems. The one named Desire, and a few on the coast there, and a couple up this way. And they were mostly touristy things, nostalgia-oriented things. But by 2005 or 6, when this was made, there were already 28, and at that time they knew of 51 that were in the planning stages. So that means something like 81 streetcars exist and are about to exist, including one in Bankville. So this is an idea that is coming back. And this was, so all these things have the little trolley line on. This is even if you had to pay $7 million, or probably closer to $10 million per mile. Now imagine what the demand for these would be if that went away and you had only a couple of $1 million at one end for a hydrogen filling station. The demand for streetcars would be dramatically improved, and the practicality of implementing them would be dramatically enhanced. So, what's the advantage of the Hydrolly? As I said, no overhead catenary. All the municipal plant that we buried stays buried. Resurrection of power lines. Onboard fuel cells plus batteries eliminate that need. No aerial poles or guy lines. One of the most offensive things to me about the trams over in Europe is that you have these beautiful churches, cathedrals, and landmarks, and you'll have a wire attachment to support the adjacent streetcar on it. And that's a person who loves architecture. I find that very, very offensive. No transformer substations. Those are usually underground, out of the way, but they still take an awful lot of copper, and they take a lot of engineering and a lot of management. This is something that the utility guys will appreciate, and that is that if you have a return path through the ground, then your buried water pipes and metal conduits and a lot of other things are corroded by the electrical sneak paths of the current. So that turns out to be a major cost of having an old-fashioned streetcar. And again, all that superstructure doesn't maintain itself. It's very expensive to maintain. The penalty is that you do now need a filling station somewhere on the system, perhaps one at each end or one at one end. So again, it avoids about $7 million a mile. It avoids the visual pollution, avoids obstruction problems. Those of you who are in construction might think if you had a wire running all the way through downtown Charlotte, how far out of town you'd have to go with a large crane in order to get from the south to the north. That's a more serious problem in a place that grows as fast as Charlotte is. And again, they're unneat because of the maintenance. If you get a wet kite cord drops over it, what happens to the kid? And I'm a tree lover, so overhead wires and trees do not live nicely together. And to me, as somebody who grew up in Charlotte and our tree canopy. The idea of having a green power people moving system that doesn't require overhead wires and allows our tree canopy to be totally unaffected is a really attractive proposition. So essentially, streetcars, if you did have the hydraulic, would lower the bar by dramatically cutting the cost of building new lines, because you only have to go about a foot into the pavement if that far, instead of going all the way down and studying all the pipes and trying to figure out how to work around that. And you don't have to drill holes for poles and route those around water pipes and gas lines and so forth. And the image of the place is very important, not just for the people who live here, but for the people who come and visit the NASCAR Hall of Fame, or the men, or increasingly a vibrant art community. Charlotte is really a beautiful place. I say that having come from here. And if we can avoid stringing tacky 1940s plants through the middle of town, it would be a good thing to avoid. History tends to favor people that accept risk. As I said, people think, well, it's risky to go with the new technology, but there's a risk of sticking with the old thing and being the last one with it. And the risk is that when the new technology, if you can see there's going to be a new technology and you don't position for it, then all of a sudden your 20-year plant that you put in has about a 5-year amortization life. The way to avoid this, and which is why I'm here today, is we need to get this whole technology into the public sector. I have to go to great lengths to try to get this into the public sector. The great lengths, thank you. The great lengths included, how many of you take the Observer? How many of you have noticed on Mondays, the Science and Technology section? That is an offshoot of Moore's plans to put a hydrogen-powered streetcar on the red line. For years and years, we could not get the Observer to cover the thing. So I got Erskine Bowles and his counterpart in South Carolina, and the heads of the community college system, and the head of Discovery Place, and the president of Duke, and a bunch of people to all right, and eventually, and then also asked a guy at Duke Energy to consider it. And so right now, Duke Energy pays for the SciTech section in the Observer, and the SciTech section is an outgrowth of this project, this hydrogen rail project. That's the good news. The bad news, they have not printed one word about hydrogen rail. They have been lauded in the Columbia Journalism Review for having come up with a SciTech section, but they still, it didn't do what it was intended to do, but we got some good out of it. So, okay. Basically, these are your 53 projects, and this is the second hand on the clock. The more time that goes by, the more money you spend on stuff that you'll never get your money back from. So this is little engineering economics. In 1960, the British decided they would design a new steam locomotive. Think about that. 1960. Yeah. The diesel had been introduced in 1925. In 2010, Charlotte began planning a new overhead wire streetcar. So we can't laugh at England. The conclusion is that the least economic harm comes from starting early and minimizing the duration of the transition. I went to Washington and talked with the new technology guys at FDA, and they liked what I had to say. And I showed them that chart right here, and I said, FDA is on the hook for $1.8 billion in incremental overhead wires for streetcars for the 50 that are on the planning boards now. And your half of that's 1.8 is just your half of it. States and the cities have to come up with another 1.8. So we're talking about $3.6 billion in a 120-year-old technology that is obviously going away. So the best thing that can happen is, instead of playing musical chairs, is to say, read my lips, read my specs, no new catenaries, and let everybody after 2 years from now or whatever, and then everybody can make their decisions together. The designers will have time to make the systems available, and the transition, that's the cheapest way you can make it happen. That's one reason I'm here, to try to win your support for that kind of thinking. Now the problem is that if you don't make such an announcement, then the people who hear about this, and they know that this technology is coming, but they don't know what the rules are going to be about its availability, will simply say, okay, we can't afford to think about streetcars, and so you don't get their benefits and you don't get their environmental purposes, and that's the worst of all worlds. So the only thing to do is to understand that this is going to happen, and to begin. Announce it and begin. Again, cut off investment, announce and cut off investment in streetcars, except for, in places where you have a very high grades and so forth. And this is the end. Thank you very much. Do we have time for any questions?
It's 1 o'clock, so if folks need to leave, feel free to leave. If you'd like to stick around for questions, we can take a few questions.
Or I'll just hang around here and you can come up and ask individually, whatever you'd like to do. And thank you very much.